Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimpler Miller, and today I have with me an author. You can see the book. Her name is Grace Feuerwerger. Okay, I probably didn't get it right. She's a professor emerita of education and ethnography at the University of Toronto and the author of Winter Light, the memoir of a child of Holocaust survivors. And as she's just been telling me her parents' story, put the book down now. Her parents' story is different than a lot of people because her parents came from abject poverty. So put us, start us before 39. Okay? Tell us put us in the situation.
Okay, so the situation before the Nazis invaded Poland. My parents from a city called Częstochowa, which in fact is well known to Polish Catholic pilgrims because it is the place of the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Very Jasna Gora Matka Boska. And that plays into my story, which I will tell later. So both families of my parents were in pretty bad straits in terms of being socially, educationally, financially, totally deprived.
Okay, no, wait. We're getting ahead. Did your parents know each other in 1939?
Oh, yes. Yes, they did. They knew each other well before the Nazis invaded. What happened, and I could start with that.
Okay, but wait. I always try to make a huge point about Poland, and people get confused. So, are we talking about the part the Nazis came into on September 1st, 1939?
Yes.
Okay.
We are.
Okay, and are we talking about the part that was annexed to the Reich or became part of the general government?
General government.
Okay.
The Nazis invaded on that 1st of September, and my parents' lives changed forever.
Okay. But just let me explain to the audience for a minute. Nazis only took over Western Poland until they broke the non-aggression pact with the Russians in June of 1941. So I always like to make it clear. Yes. And which part, I actually have a map that I printed out so I can memorize this, which part we're talking about. Okay, so now tell about your parents knowing each other before.
So it's actually a beautiful love story. And what happened was my mother was supposedly a very, very pretty young 17-year-old girl. This was in around 1938. And she had an older brother and a younger brother. She was in the middle. And my father was friendly with her older brother. My father turned out to be 8 years older than my mother. But when he saw her visiting, her brother, he fell madly in love with her, madly. And they started, quote, going out. They were, as you said, they were poor, but they started seeing each other. And both of them they could have been protagonists in a novel by Flaubert or Tolstoy because of this whole story, which I'm about to tell. So everything was going well. My mother was very dark, raven-haired, black eyes, very pretty, white, very light alabaster skin. I mean, really something, supposedly. My father, on the other hand, looked like a Pole. He was blue-eyed. He could have passed for Polish Catholic easily. So they were a very interesting couple right from the beginning, visually. And also emotionally, my mother was wild as the wind. And that turned out to be a bit of a problem later on when she became my mother, way after the war, emotionally kind of a bit unstable. My father was a much more quiet, kind of intellectual kind of man, if he could have had the education that he unfortunately was denied. So they started going out, everything was fine. And then about 6 or 7 months later, my father's father died suddenly of a massive heart attack at age 49. And that put the family into even more desperate straits. And here was my father. He was the youngest of 8 siblings. and most of them were girls. He was the boy. And suddenly, where would even the little bit of money that they had, where would that come from? His mother said to him, look what happened to the disaster that has befallen us. Your father has died. We have to try to find a girl for you that comes from a better class
Mm.
so that her family can bring in money for us. My father was shocked, but he was grieving for his father and wanting to do right for the family. He was obedient to his mother, and he decided the only thing he could do, even though it was totally against his heart, he broke off with my mother. You can well imagine how devastated my mother was, jilted, etc. And by the way, she had a pretty tough mother who said, I never want to see that guy's face again. I don't want to have anything to do with that family after what he just did. So he had an official engagement, and with a
Right.
rabbi, all of
Yes,
that.
the board. Yeah.
But he didn't have his heart in it. And several months later, my father said, I cannot marry this person, this girl. Well, then that family was devastated, and they had to get an official annulment by the rabbi. I mean, it must have been absolutely awful. The way my father and mother described it to me years later, it was a complete brouhaha. And my mother's mother at that point, my father went back to my mother on bended knee, asking to become engaged to her. My mother's mother said, are you kidding? After what he did? No way. But my mother loved my father, and they got together. And that actually, I do want to say, and it will become more clear, that saved their lives, their being together. What happened was, so they were together.
But they weren't married yet.
No, they were engaged, but they were not married. They were planning a wedding. Remember, this was before the Nazis
Yes,
invaded.
I know.
Planning a little wedding. And then on September 1st, 1939, the Nazis came in. And of course, everything stopped. They were together. They had to be forced out of their little homes, their places, and into the ghettos with everyone else. And as I don't have to reiterate the terrible conditions in the ghetto, but they were together. And that's all that counted, really. So we go forward from the ghetto. Many people died. Many people in their own families starved. The younger ones, and so on, cousins, aunts, uncles. One of my father's brothers did. It was obviously terrifying. And then in 1942, September the 21st, 1942, was the mass deportation to the death camp Treblinka. What happened was...
Wait. I want to give our audience. January 20th, 1942 is the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, when the Nazis decided on the final solution. And then Auschwitz, has already existed as a prisoner of war camp, etc., starts to get revved up in March of 42, and then things start really getting going towards the deportation. But
Yes.
Treblinka, I can't remember when it was opened, but it, I think, already existed as a death camp before Auschwitz existed as a death camp.
Yes, I think you're right. Yes. So there was they didn't have to wait. It was all set up. So there they were, my father's family, my mother's family, and all the other Jewish families in Częstochowa, rounded up in the town square, and the usual, this one goes there, this one goes there. My father, fortunately, because of his status, someone who had not much education, he knew how to weld. He was a welder. It turns out that there was a munitions factory, a German munitions factory just outside of the town of Częstochowa. It had been a prison, but the Nazis had converted it to a munitions factory, a very well-known one, and it was called, I'm going to read it to you, it was called, the acronym was HASAG, H-A-S-A-G, standing for Hugo Schneider, the name of the person in charge, Aktiengesellschaft Metallwarenfabrik, an arms manufacturer, one of the top in Germany. They had 8 factories in Germany and 3 in Poland. And that one, when they saw that my father knew how to deal with armaments, with metal, he was sent to that camp, to the forced labor camp. Now, there was one very monumental event that took place. I have to go back for a moment to that town square where they were all rounded up. Usually, people went with their families. They didn't know where they were going. They wanted to stay together. My father, God rest his soul, made this decision. He said, no, I and my wife, because that's what he felt, he felt we're married, we are going to go together, not with our respective families. Wherever they're going to send us, I want us to be together. My mother agreed. Of course, the families, who knows, it was such a chaotic situation, whatever. That's what saved their lives. Because what happened, my father, who really had a kind of a fierce determination, which you will see later on as well, he was like a man on a mission. He was going to save my mother's life no matter what. That's what his promise was to himself and to her. And that is what kept him going in the midst of all of this insanity. He was going to save her life. So he somehow...
Wait. I want to clarify for our audience. Treblinka was a death sentence. It wasn't like Auschwitz when you got there and you might survive.
No,
Treblinka, they went directly to be they were gassed, right? And there were a few Jews who had to do the cleanup, but basically Treblinka was a death sentence. And that's where originally the Warsaw Ghetto people were sent, is Treblinka, because it's near Warsaw. Okay, back to you. Okay.
The luck for my parents was that they had there was that munitions factory right outside of their town. And so those people who were young enough and looked like they could work were sent there instead of Treblinka. The other ones, of course, were sent to the rest of my parents' families, both sides. Nobody survived except my father and mother. So they were sent to this munitions factory, which, of course, because the Nazis needed them to work, especially my father, who was a good worker, excellent welder, got a bit of extra food, etc., because they needed to keep them alive to keep creating these arms. So, and then another good piece of fortune happened, was put into my father's lap. The Nazi guard that oversaw his unit, and remember, my mother was with the women in a totally different part of the factory.
But she was working too, in the fact.
She was not as good a worker as my father. My father was of profession. He was a welder, so, but the guard took a liking to my father. And my father said, I remember this so well. He said, we got along. If it hadn't been for the war, we might have been good friends. How sad, how amazing, how it's a human story. So the guard would bring my father even more food.
Wait. Was the guard German or Polish?
German. He was German. And he was able to somehow, when the Oberkommandant was not looking, because he was not the top banana, he would bring extra food to my mother. I suppose for the guard, maybe there was a symmetry there. For the guard, maybe that was his way of doing something good in the midst of all this evil. So they got along. And he sort of looked out. My father kept telling him, just look out for my wife. Because you see, there with bureaucratic regularity, the Nazis would send off people from that camp, from the munitions factory, to Treblinka. Anyone who got sick, anyone who looked like they were lazy or couldn't work, immediately off they went. And one day, they were there for 3 years, from 1942 to 1945. Now, so they hung on, and the guard even allowed, when it was possible, for my father and mother to meet at night. It's very interesting, very unusual love story, literally.
Right.
Well, sometime towards the end of 44, yeah, definitely towards the end of, well, maybe already, yeah, end of 44, the guard rushes over to my father. And by the way, he also gave him a lot of cigarettes with food. You know, cigarettes was a very big deal
Yes.
then. He rushed over to my father, very upset, saying, I'm so sorry, but your wife has been sent into the line that is going, the transport that is going to Treblinka, the next transport. The Oberkommandant recognized my mother's beauty, so to speak. My mother would always say, he would yell at me and say, you dark beauty, you're going on the next transport to Treblinka. He kept mocking her until finally that's what happened. She started not feeling well. It looked like it was typhus, and she was set in that line. And my father said to the guard, just tell me where she is. So the guard pointed to where she was, and my father literally ran to that area, saw her in the line. And remember, there were Nazis all over the place with their boots and with their guns and with the dogs and the killing and the shooting. He just ran over to the line. He saw her. And, you know, it was a munitions camp, so they had their hair. You know, it was not... So, and my mother had very thick hair, dark hair. My father said, and she corroborated, he grabbed her by the hair out of the line. And he said, you know, they didn't shoot. Somehow, maybe they weren't watching at that particular moment, or they didn't care. I grabbed her out of the line. We ran back to where the guard was, and he hid them. The guard hid them in a place. Little did they know that very soon after, well, a few weeks after, the Soviet army, the Russian army was very close. And my father said they began to hear a lot of bombing and shooting and yelling. And the guard, again, I mean, it was amazing. He was like their fairy godfather, fairy whatever. He said, you know, the Russians are very close. We have to get out of here because they're going to shoot us all, in terms of the Germans. And he said, you will be safe. They will liberate you. And my father, and by the way, they should have retreated even a few days earlier. But this Oberkommandant and others were so intent on getting as many Jews as they could to Treblinka that slowed down their retreat. And what happened was, when the Soviets finally arrived, they were not as far away as they should have been. And most of them were shot summarily by the Soviet army. The guard was shot. But before that, as they were running, my father shouted out to the guard, please tell me your name. Tell me your last name. Where are you from in Germany? Maybe after the war, we can meet each other. But the guard didn't hear him because of all the noise, the din. And my father kept repeating that, but the guard kept saying, I can't hear you. I have to run. And that was the last time the guard and my father saw each other. There was a little silver cigarette case, kind of beat up, that my father always kept on the dresser in our home. And that was from the guard who gave him cigarettes from that silver case. For my father, that was the greatest treasure he ever had because of the friendship he had with this guard. And it does show the humanity in the midst of evil, how these two men, and they were about the same age, in other circumstances, probably, I mean, they had a certain kind of similar sensibility, probably. They could have been friends. And my father would always say, I do want to say this because my father was, he said, you have to judge people individually. Look at that. He was, quote, a Nazi. And you know what? He was a good man. He cared. And he said, that's what one always has to remember. In the midst of even the worst situation, you cannot judge a whole group. You must look at each individual person. Are they good? Do they care? Do they have a heart? Because this man did, he said. Anyway, I'm moving ahead here, but so the Soviet army came.
So when is it now? What's the date?
So the date is now January the 16th, I believe, 1945.
Right, a week before Auschwitz was liberated.
Yes, yes, a week before, I believe.
Yes, Auschwitz was liberated January 27th.
So there you are, January, and so the Soviet army comes in and says to all of them, of course, they were all malnourished. I mean, some were almost dead. And you are free. They came with food. They said, you are free. Here, they came with food. They came with clothing. But where would they go? They went, of course, right back to their town, which was right there, trying to look for survivors. The problem was there were no survivors on either side of their families, absolutely none. My father and mother went to his apartment, the original apartment, the little apartment they had. And he describes how they knocked on the door. A man opened the door with a vodka bottle in his hand and said, don't you even think of coming in here. I will kill you because he knew they were survivors. They were Jewish and they were just coming out of this factory. He said, I will kill you. You're not taking this away from me. I'm sorry. This is mine now. So that was it. They ended up in some other part of town with other survivors. And very soon afterward, they realized my mother was pregnant. So do the math. My mother became pregnant in the concentration camp. My brother was born in July of 1945. They were liberated in January. So as I say, do the math. But having a child so soon was horrific. There was no food. I mean, Poland was destroyed. That part of Poland for sure was completely destroyed. And the point was, where would my mother even give birth? She ended up giving birth with other Polish Catholic women, because she was the only Jewish woman, in a monastery, which was turned into a makeshift hospital. My brother was literally born under the icon of the Virgin Mary. The story, you can't make this stuff up. You know what I'm saying? It's unbelievable. And my mother always said that there was something really kind of eerie about it, but interesting. She said she couldn't believe, and the other Polish Catholic women who knew that she was Żydowska, she was a Jewish woman, said, Żydowska, as if she'd come back from the dead. And in a way, that was true. I mean, she wasn't supposed to survive. And then my brother was born. My brother actually went to visit years later to that monastery. The bishop gave him it's a whole story. He went, some of the nuns remembered, the old nuns remembered that birth. And it was really quite an extraordinary situation, but he was a little baby. There was no food. My mother didn't even have enough for milk. And so they decided they had to stay in Częstochowa just to let the baby become older so that he could survive whatever the next step would be. And the next step was trying to get out of Poland to a displaced persons camp. Now, they wanted to wait. Some of the other survivors got out right away because, I mean, my parents were the only couple from their city at that time who survived intact from before the war. Most of them either, if they had been married, lost their spouses or their children. It was a horror story, of course. My parents were the only ones who actually both survived because of my father. He made good on his promise. He was like Superman, unbelievable. But there was this baby who was starving, literally. Well, they did their best, and for some reason, the baby stayed alive. They knew that if they didn't get out, the borders would be sealed, but they kept waiting for the child to grow. And then here's another date, July the 4th, 1946. That's almost a year after my brother was born. A pogrom broke out in Kielce, in the south of Poland. The people wanted to kill whatever Jews Hitler didn't manage to kill. When my parents found out about that, they realized they cannot wait any longer. They have to get out of there right away. So then there's a whole story of how they went through the border illegally. And they would even say, we were with our little child. He was almost 1 year old. And it was at night and there was a full moon. And the little baby, my brother, would point to the moon. And they'd have to, hold his mouth and say, no, you have to be quiet. Because, of course, there were guards. There were border guards all around. Well, they made it. And they got to a displaced persons camp in the American-controlled zone of Germany, in Bavaria.
Right, near Munich.
Near Munich, yeah. And what's interesting about that is once they got to a place of safety, because there they had people cared, had, food and so on. And my brother started to revive. It was then that my father fell into a depression after all that he did. But you see, the doctor explained, there were doctors and nurses there, explained that was a very natural reaction. My father, for so many years, was so intent. I mean, his whole purpose in life was to save my mother. So he had all this extra energy, which once he didn't need that anymore, he slumped into a depression. And the doctor, my father would tell us, the doctor said, do anything, even chop wood. You will see, you will get better, but just keep yourself busy. This will pass. And it did pass. And my father, the reason why I ended up being born in Montreal, Canada, my father had 8 siblings. His oldest sister, who was 15 years older than him, had moved to Montreal in the late 1920s. She had married. Actually, this was, remember, the same mother who wanted my father to marry some money. Well, she did marry someone with a bit of money. So they went on a honeymoon. My uncle's dream was to see Canada. They went to Montreal and fell in love with the city of Montreal, which is my beloved city as well, and decided to move there. This was in 1926. And so there they were. They established a home in Montreal. My cousin was born there and so on. And they lived relatively well. My aunt tried so hard to get her family out of Poland. This was in the late 20s, the 30s, not possible. And it wasn't possible, not because of the Germans, and this must be said, because the Canadian government did not allow any Jews into the country. Before the war, during the war, and even after the war, the government of William Lyon Mackenzie King there was in the archives, historians unearthed documents to prove in written letters,
Yes, yes, I understand.
you know the story, that Mackenzie King and the Minister of Immigration and Mines were writing to each other, not one Jew should be allowed into Canada. And that's where the book None is Too Many, written by two historians, I know them well, they were my colleagues. One is still alive, Harold Troper. uh, they wrote, a book came out in 1982 about this horrible event. The Jews were not allowed in until Mackenzie King retired from the Liberal government, and Louis Saint Laurent took over as leader. And when he took over, that was 1948, then Jews were allowed into the country. And that's when my parents, because my father had a blood relative, his sister. So finally, after all that, they were allowed into the country. Thank God for Louis Saint Laurent.
That, you know, I don't think without asking my brother's wife, because her parents, both survivors, but didn't know each other, got to Montreal and met. But I never knew that they couldn't have done that until after 1948.
Yeah.
So I didn't know that part of the story at all.
I think a few may have come
No,
right after Mackenzie King retired, which was maybe the end of 47. I'm not sure.
no, this would have been thinking of,
Bureaucrat, you know,
yeah,
my parents were on the list, probably not the first, I don't know. They came in 48 and were reunited with my aunt, who at that time was much older than the last time my mother or father had seen her. And my mother said, at the train station, because they took a ship to Halifax, then a train to
right,
Montreal. She said, I let out an incredible gasp because your your aunt looked exactly like what I remember my mother-in-law looked like, my father's mother.
right,
She, at
right,
that, she was the same age as my
right.
grandmother
When she
was,
had left, right,
was sent to Treblinka. So that's the story of their coming to Canada. But of course, given that they came from such deprived backgrounds, my father, who was really, and it's not because he was my father that I say this, he really had a kind of an intellectual bent to him. He could have been a professor. He could have been a writer. He was a really astute political analyst. He always got it right when it came to world. I wish he were here right now, I must say. So he was very much, he had a lot of inner rage, a lot of sorrow, not only about the horrifying losses, but his whole life had been in a way taken away from him, his professional life. I remember when he would take me to the library and show me the children's books, and he read avidly. He could read, he taught himself Russian, German, and of course he knew some Polish, Yiddish, he knew of course Hebrew from liturgy. And he would say, those are your books now, but I'm going to show you the books I'm reading and you're going to read them too one day. I mean, he had that amazing intellectual kind of approach. And I must say, I'm my father's daughter. I did become a professor. I adore issues of language and culture the way my father did. You know, my father made a decision when they came to Montreal, instead of living with most of the immigrants, Jewish immigrants, he said, and I'll say it in Yiddish and then I'll translate, ich will gern wohnen mit de Franzosen in nicht mit de Englische. Zij haben a sach Leben. I would rather live with the French Canadians. They have a lot more life, joie de vivre, than the English. So we lived in a French Canadian neighborhood. And that's also one of a kind. And I
yes,
must say that gave me a very interesting perspective on issues of language, cultural diversity, just the whole notion of peaceful coexistence. And I have to say, and my first chapter talks about how the French Canadian neighbors on our street and around were very kind to us. I really mean that. They knew what had happened to us. Someone told them. My parents, not someone. I think a social worker who sort of came every so often. And they would bring gifts and they would invite me to their home because I became friendly with one of their children, the next door neighbors, Francoise. And that's a whole story in itself, which I hope people will read because it shows this intercultural coexistence that needs, especially now, that needs to be really put in relief.
Yeah.
It needs to be shown again. There is great kindness, there is great goodness, and we mustn't forget that. So I grew up the only Jewish family in that particular little neighborhood. But then, of course, I went to English schools. I didn't go to French schools. I was not Catholic. And my parents wanted me to learn English. You see, I didn't know much English until I got to school. I was speaking French, and then there was Polish and Yiddish at home. So it's quite an unusual story for a child of survivors. But I'm grateful to, again, my father with his very different views on life.
On life, I was going to say exactly. And this has been a delightful conversation, but we are at the end. So I will, your choice, either if you have a website or I will give the link to the book on Amazon so that people can see it.
Yeah.
And I thank you for sharing this really beautiful love story, as you said.
Thanks.
And as I end every episode of this, I say, may the memories of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.